Okay, so far we have figured out how to make the cast shadow and the form shadow. And if this is all you ever knew how to do, you'd end up with sort of a Frank Miller, Sin City graphic abstraction. And that's cool, but it's not really realistic rendering. What we want to do is describe the form. And the way we're going to do that is by using value gradation across the illuminated part of the form. And when you see this, it just tells your brain what the shape is. So really, value is form. Because when you look at these two very similar objects, you know immediately this one has a sharper corner and one has a rounder corner. And the only indication of that is how quickly I transition the value from light to dark. Because in one case it's sort of a curved surface and the other one it is a very angular surface. And your brain immediately figured that out based on the rendering. So that's what we have to figure out how to do, how to communicate to the viewer the shape of our object using value. No problem. So here you can see that sort of planar abstraction. And one way that you could blend between these planes to smooth it out would be to use on-screen mixing. That's the way I normally paint. But another way would be to take those same planes and instead of using the brush tool, to go ahead and use the Smudge Tool. And depending on how you set it up, it gives a very nice blending look to smooth out that value transition. And if you want to know more about this, I've actually released a couple videos recently in the free library that have included tool presets for the Smudge Tool, as well as some technique overview. So head over to the free library and check that out. A practical example of this would be back to the very early video in which I talked about doing an apple rendering, first as planes, and then mixing between the planes. Well, if you don't want to use the brush tool, using the smudge brush is sometimes a nice alternative. So here I'm just changing the brush diameter, but I'm really not doing any sampling. It's doing that mixing automatically based on the way the smudge tool is set up. But anyway, that's technical stuff. That's besides the point in this series. What we're going to be doing is making careful value transitions, and the tools that you decide to use for this task are really up to you. In fact, I hope there's somebody out there using charcoal along with this video. That would just be great. So what we're going to do here is look at some very basic planar changes and think about how the light is going to react to that surface. So if we just had a totally flat surface and sunlight, we would have one value. For as far as you can see, there's always going to be the same angle between the flat plane of the ground and the angle of the sun. Well, if we had two planes that were at right angles to each other, they would have two values because each one has a different angle relative to the sun. Well, sometimes you're actually going to have pairs of angles, as in pairs of values. So a stair set is a great example of this. You'll notice that the front faces here are all being illuminated in the same way because directional light is pointing at them with equal intensity. You'll also see the top faces are all the same values one another. Same deal. They are pairs of angles, which means they have pairs of values. Okay, let's go back to our simple single ground plane scenario. But let's take a look here if we made a tunnel in that ground. So if you look at it in side view, let's envision those little arrows that point off the surface. The one that's going to be pointing most directly at the light source is this one over here on the right side. So when I render my form, that is going to be the brightest value. With that in mind, I've actually rendered the ground plane as sort of a middle gray, knowing that I need to reserve some brighter values for where it's actually the brightest. Because a really common mistake is to just make the top surfaces of things the brightest. But that's not necessarily the right way to do it most of the time. And then if you can imagine the light angle of the opposite sides of this tunnel, they are going to be a little bit darker. Now, because of the angle of the camera, you can't see that side very well, but just know that you're going to have a relatively darker value on the opposite side, because this is sort of like an inside-out sphere. And then if you want to go ahead and polish it, totally fine. Again, that's totally up to you. The important thing to remember here is that the brightest value is the surface that's pointing most directly at the sun. And if you're just starting out, your intuitive guess might be wrong. Okay, with this next example, we are going to keep everything the same, except instead of a tunnel, it's like a hill. So let's think about this in the side view. We're going to do our little diagram again. So we have the light direction coming in from this angle, And we are going to compare that to the various little arrows pointing off of the surfaces. And we can immediately tell that this part of the cylinder is where it's going to be the brightest, and then it's going to fall off from there. And then eventually at the very back, there's also going to be a terminator here and a bit of a cast shadow. So when we make our rendering, it's pretty straightforward. The ground plane is going to stay one value. It's going to be a relatively brighter value where the hill is pointing most directly at the sun. And then it's going to be a darker value as it rolls down the form towards the ground plane. Because if you think about it, the sides of that hill are really not pointing towards the sun at all. They're pointing a lot further away from the sun than the ground plane is. So it's going to be a little bit darker. And then I've also included the cast shadow, which is almost invisible based on this camera angle. But you remember, based on where the terminator is, the last little bit of that hill is indeed in shadow. All right, next up, we are going to do a little divot in the ground. So here, instead of having a tunnel, which is like a cylinder, this is as if you put a golf ball in the snow and then remove the golf ball. So here with our diagram, we can judge some relative values. We have the brightest angle right here. So that's going to be our brightest value. And then we have some sort of in-between values around the edge. And then notice that we do have a terminator here and a little bit of a cast shadow. Now, again, because our camera is placed where it is, you're not going to see a whole lot of that cast shadow. But when we do our rendering, that area will just need to be a little bit darker. So for the rendering, we'll start with the ground plane being a value that is not the brightest. And then I'm going to go ahead and darken down inside of the divot. But then after that, it is important to put in that bright value. And this is almost like you're rendering a sphere. It's sort of like an inside-out sphere. So the brightest area is going to be circular. It's not going to be a band like in our last example with the tunnel. And when I do this polish, I like to average things out. I have a tendency to make things too high contrast. And when you're working with matte finish objects, they actually have a very subtle value transition. Anytime you have too high of a contrast, it starts to indicate that the surface is shinier or glossier, and that's not what we're working with for this series. You know, you can think of a matte finish surface as a clay model, or a car with primer but no paint. And then of course you're going to see a little bit of that darkness around the closer lip, as we saw in our side diagram. That's where the cast shadow is. But predominantly from this angle, what you're really seeing is that illuminated area in the bottom of the divot. So the next example we've got here is the opposite. It is a little hill peeking out from the ground plane. You could think of this as like a small sphere that is protruding just a little bit, not even half of a sphere. And when we look at the side diagram, we can see a few things. We have a very familiar hot spot here where it's pointing most directly at the sun angle. And then we follow that around until the light rays are parallel with the surface. That's where our terminator is. And so the last little bit of this hill is going to be in shadow. And ever so slightly, it would do a cast shadow, although that's not going to be terribly visible. We'll just indicate it as a bit of a form shadow on the reverse side of the hill. But the rendering goes just like before. In fact, I'm going to leave the ground plane the exact same value that it was, and all I need is a relatively brighter value to mark in that highlight. So what we start to understand is that plane change means value change. Value change means form change. And then the question is, well, how much is it changing? When you look at a simplified head here, you can see there's some soft transitions, which is a longer gradation. And then there's some sharper transitions, which have a much quicker transfer from light to dark. And immediately you know something about the form. You know that where there's a sharp change in value, there's a sharp change in the form. So now we are sculpting, if you really want to think about it that way. And the values that we lay down are going to tell about the surface that the viewer is looking at. So let's make our object a little more complicated, and this time it's going to have a more interesting profile. First, you can see it's got almost like a quarter of a cylinder. And then when that finishes, it becomes a flat board, which is parallel with the ground. So that's actually going to have the same value as the ground because it's the same light angle as the ground is. Then it takes a 90-degree turn up, And then it has a very simple rounded edge. You could call that a beveled edge if you wanted. And then there's another parallel ground plane. So when I do my rendering here, the important thing is, what do these transitions look like? So the value that I start with here on this flat surface is going to need to be the exact same value as the upper parallel surface. Because this object I'm drawing it as a little bit lighter local value than the actual material of the ground. But the important thing is that within this object, that the pair of like angles, the two top facing surfaces, have the same value. Then I know that the surface that picks up the most light is going to be the edge of that bevel, because that's pointing most tangent to the light source. And then the darkest areas are going to be the ones that are these front-facing surfaces, here and here. So this is essentially a rough block-in of the values. Now it becomes a question of smoothing. How do those planes transition into one another? So on this very gentle, slow curve, I'm going to have a airbrush, super soft, super slow gradation. Now when it hits this corner, it's a 90-degree corner, so it's going to be a very harsh transition. It's going to go from light to dark. No gradation in between. Now up here at this bevel, it's a little bit softer. So I'm going to soften that edge a little bit. And the same deal as it reaches the top plane. So you can see here, I was very intentional about the way that I transition from plane to plane. And in doing so, it gives a very clear representation of a very specific form. You look at this and you know, I can see the shape. So let's go ahead and modify it to look like this. Here we have a transition from hard machined edges into a soft organic shape. It's almost as if we had the previous object made of clay, and then we just sort of rounded out the front. Well, that is going to be sculpting with the way we transition from one value to another. And for this, I'm going to be using the Smudge Tool, although you could use any method you want. The important thing is being very careful about how I'm choosing to transition from one value to another value. It's amazing how quickly just doing a little bit of smudging between this hard edge, turning it into a soft edge, just transforms the shape. If you were to imagine contours over top of this new object, it would look very different than those previous hard right angles that we had. And really all it took was smudging. And of course, at the end, I'm going to go ahead and put hard edges back around the silhouette, because when you're painting, you don't want to be sloppy. If you have a soft transition, that's fine, but eventually there's probably going to be a hard edge somewhere. So hopefully this makes a very crucial point painfully clear. The way that you treat your edges tells the viewer a lot about the form. It was not a huge difference for me to go from a very hard mechanical looking object to a totally organic soft shape, almost like a stone that was tumbled in a river. So the way you use your media, the way you communicate those edges is just going to really sell the form. So do not get lazy when it comes to that transition between one plane and another plane. Okay, so speaking of that transition from one plane to another plane, there is often a small bevel or fillet, and a fillet is sort of like the opposite of a bevel, between right angles. Something that you would think of as absolutely a right angle between two surfaces. If you look close enough, it's actually not. And when you have a little angle down here, it's probably going to be pointing pretty tangent to the light source, which means it's probably going to be pretty bright. And this is something often overlooked by beginners. They will think of it as a perfect right angle, and in doing so, will have incorrect values. To make it look more realistic, you might want to include a little hot spot down there where it's catching that light just a little bit. And then the question of how does it transition between those two planes would tell you a little bit about the shape of the profile. Here I started with sort of a hard transition, as if it were a machined bevel, and then I smoothed it a bit to make it smoothed out, almost like a half pipe on a skateboarding ramp. So the point of all this is use the light angle to help you determine relative values. It's not an exact science. All you need to do is make sure that the ones that are the brightest are the ones that are pointing most directly at the light source. And then the next most important thing is where you have two different planes meeting one another. What is the transition? Is it hard or is it soft? So to practice these two things, I've included a variety of profiles, just like the last few examples. And these are in the homework resources folder, and I encourage you to render them. Here you're going to want to be more specific about the brushwork that you're using because, as we showed, the difference between a hard edge and a soft edge really does matter. So I encourage you to take your time with these. This is great practice, even though it's not all that sexy, and it's totally going to increase the realism in your rendering.